In the world we live in today, there seems to be so many problems being addressed, but for some reason the national debt really hasn't been addressed much, or has just been put aside. And for some of us, we don't even know what the word national debt is. Some people have the question of, what does the national debt have to do with me? Well, the national debt decreases our ability to respond to problems, nature or man-made. Basically, what that means is if you're stuck in a hurricane, tornado, a fire, we might take a little longer to save you, which means you might already died. With a high national debt, we have a greater risk of getting into a financial crisis, even though some of us have already been calling it a financial crisis.
Financial crisis.
This financial crisis may look like a 2008 stock market crash or the Great Depression. Higher debt means more money is needed, so the federal government may raise taxes, interest rates, just to be able to pay a little bit of the debt. Now that you know these problems that may affect you in some way, shape, or form, you probably want to know what the national debt is. The national debt is divided into two debts. The intergovernmental debt, which is debt held by government agencies, and the debt held by public. The debt held by public stands 2/3 of the overall debt. The debt held by public is when federal government owes money to its investors. The intergovernmental debt is basically when a federal agency has more than enough money and decides to put the extra money into another agency. For example, the Social Security has more than enough money, so it lends it to the U.S. Treasury Department, which causes the intergovernmental debt. But to fully understand what national debt is, you have to know what the debt to GDP ratio is. The debt to GDP ratio is also called the debt to gross domestic product ratio. It is really useful for investors who are planning to invest in a country. It allows investors to see if a country has the ability to pay off its debt. The debt to GDP compares two things: the national debt for that year and the total value of everything produced in the country of that year. The World Bank did a research and found that if a country's debt to GDP ratio passes the 77% mark for a long period of time, the economic growth slows down. And for every percentage that passes the 77% mark, it will cost that country 1.7% of the economic growth. Let's start with the history of all of this debt. It started with the Revolutionary War between Great Britain and the American colonies, who wanted freedom. In order to win, the colonial leaders decided to borrow money from France and the Netherlands. After the war, the Continental Congress, similar to the US Congress, didn't have the power or the rights to tax citizens to pay for the debt. Therefore, the debt kept on increasing. By 1790, Alexander Hamilton, the first Secretary of the U.S. Treasury Department, announced that the national debt is at $75 million, and its debt to GDP ratio is at 30%. Of course, at that time, the U.S. economy was growing quite fast, and that did lower the debt to GDP ratio to about 10%. The War of 1812 made the debt rise. By 1828, when Andrew Jackson was in office, the national debt was at $58 million. By 1835, Andrew Jackson finished paying off the $58 million in national debt. Can you believe the national debt was once paid off? Andrew Jackson was able to raise $58 million by selling all the federal-owned land in the West. But sadly, within a year, the United States started economic recession. During the Civil War, the debt skyrocketed to $2.76 billion by 1866. In the late 90s, economic growth shrank the debt to GDP. After World War I, the debt to GDP ratio reached a record high of 33%. In that time, it was $25 billion. But in today's money, it's about $334 billion. Then the Great Depression happened. It affected the national debt greatly. After the Great Depression, World War II happened to come. The debt to GDP ratio reached a 77%, which has never happened in the nation's history. Then after that, it reached 113%. And then after all of the wars, the debt to GDP ratio was 24%. Recession and rising interest rates and permanent tax cuts made the national debt swing up again. Here I have a clip of someone explaining what these three presidents did to the national debt.
In the year 2000, we had $6 trillion on about a $12 trillion economy. At the end of President Bush's time, then it went to $10 trillion of debt, again on something like a $14 or $15 trillion economy. Under President Obama, at the end of his, it went to 20. So under that administration, this government doubled America's debt to $20 trillion. Now, after just a couple of years of President Trump, we now are at $22 trillion.
Therefore, for the year 2020, I believe the presidential candidates should talk about the national debt. Hopefully this video is helpful for some people, and hopefully you learned something about national debt. Have a great day.